Theo, wake up. Please wake up." Mira Ashford screamed in desperation, while her bloodied hands trembled over the shattered glass of the Bentley Continental. The brick slipped from her trembling fingers onto the cold concrete floor of the underground parking garage. Shards of glass glittered like cursed diamonds under the flickering yellow lights of the Brennan estate's basement in Chicago. Inside the luxury vehicle, little Theo Brennan lay unconscious. His face flushed crimson from the heat, his lips cracked and dry, sweat pooling in the hollow of his small throat. The dashboard thermometer read 126 degrees. "Oh God, what have I done?" Mira whispered to herself. But there wasn't time for regret. Only saving this child mattered now. Her sliced hands didn't matter anymore. The searing pain was nothing compared to the terror gripping her chest as she looked at Theo like this, the 8-year-old boy she'd been caring for over the past 3 months. The child who called her Miss Mira with those gray eyes so much like his father's. Eyes that held a loneliness she recognized in her own reflection. She was just a nanny running from her own demons, hiding from an abusive ex-husband who'd left cigarette burns on her wrists. She had no business loving this boy as fiercely as she did. But here she was, bleeding onto the concrete floor of a Mafia boss's mansion, willing to destroy a $200,000 car without a second thought. If this story grips your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in love against all odds. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss a single chapter. The previous evening, everything had been perfectly, terrifyingly normal, and Mira had no idea she was stepping into the beginning of a nightmare that would culminate in this garage. Less than 24 hours earlier, the Brennan estate loomed over the Gold Coast like a Gothic cathedral raised from shadow and dirty money. The black granite walls swallowed light instead of reflecting it, and the stained glass windows glittered like the eyes of a demon watching the city of Chicago stretch beneath them. Tonight, more than 300 of the city's most powerful guests poured in for the Brennan family's annual charity gala, an event the elite called a Night of Angels, and the FBI called a gathering of devils in human skin. Baccarat crystal chandeliers hovered above a ceiling 12 meters high, spilling warm golden light onto black marble floors like honey dripping into hell. Servers in simple black uniforms drifted through the crowd like ghosts, carrying trays of Dom Perignon champagne and canapés prepared by a Michelin-starred chef. Liv Jazz murmured from the corner of the ballroom, soft enough not to drown out conversation, elegant enough to remind everyone they were standing in the home of one of the most powerful men in the American Midwest. Mira Ashford stood in the shadows near the kitchen doors, her plain black uniform allowing her to melt into the walls. She had learned how to become invisible during 3 months of work here, a survival skill she had spent 27 turbulent years refining. Her amber eyes swept the room, watching without ever staring, listening without ever seeming to listen. That was how she had survived 12 foster families, 4 years of hell with Derek, and every single day since she had stepped into this house without knowing who truly owned it. Then, he appeared. Callum Brennan entered the ballroom and everything seemed to tilt toward him, as though gravity itself had shifted. At 37, the head of the Brennan Empire stood 1.85 meters tall, broad-shouldered in a flawlessly tailored black 3-piece suit, dark hair streaked with a few silver strands at his temples like ash from a burned-out past. A faint scar traced his left jaw, a souvenir from a reckoning 10 years earlier that he alone had walked away from to tell the story. But what made Mira shiver wasn't the scar. It was his eyes, steel gray, cold as a Chicago winter, and utterly empty as they swept the crowd. The eyes of a man who had seen too much death to fear anything anymore. The same eyes Mira saw every day reflected in the gaze of the 8-year-old boy she cared for. The mayor of Chicago approached to shake Callum's hand, as though asking permission rather than offering greeting. An Illinois state senator hovered beside him with a sycophantic smile. 2 real estate tycoons Mira recognized from the front page of the Chicago Tribune waited their turn. None of them dared hold Callum's gaze for long. They knew what he was. The whole city did. But his money was clean enough on paper, his lawyers good enough, and his power vast enough that no one dared say it aloud. Then she appeared. Victoria Ashworth descended the staircase like a queen deigning to meet her subjects, a crimson Valentino gown clinging to her body like blood against pale skin. Platinum blonde hair was swept into an elegant knot, exposing a long neck circled by diamonds Mira guessed were worth more than the apartment she had once rented in Boston. At 34, Callum Brennan's fiancée embodied calculated perfection, from her smile to her gaze, from the way she laid her hand on his arm to the way she inclined her head to greet guests. Everything was performance. Mira had seen enough pretenders in her life to recognize another, but she also saw what most people missed. When Victoria touched Callum, he didn't respond. He didn't lean toward her, didn't tighten his grip, and there wasn't a single spark of warmth in those cold gray eyes. This wasn't love. This was a transaction. A political marriage between two powerful dynasties meant to merge empires. Victoria was the daughter of Malcolm Ashworth, the magnate who controlled the entire eastern seaboard port network. This union would create a force no one could touch. And the wedding would take place in 2 weeks. Mira knew she shouldn't care. She was only a nanny, an invisible ghost in this house. A woman running from her past with no right to think about the future. But when her gaze accidentally collided with Callum's across the crowded room, for a single instant she saw something she was certain no one else did. Loneliness. Absolute and complete. The same as in Theo's eyes, the same as in her own. Miss Mira. The small voice pulled Mira out of her thoughts. She turned and saw Theo standing behind her. His little navy suit rumpled after hours of being dragged through the party to greet guests like a decorative object. The 8-year-old boy said nothing more, only stood there with gray eyes far too old for his age, waiting. Mira didn't ask what he wanted. She didn't need to. 3 months in this house had taught her how to read the silent language of this child. The way Theo leaned slightly toward her meant he wanted to leave the crowd. The way his fingers dug into the hem of his jacket meant he was holding something back. Maybe fear, maybe anger, maybe a loneliness too large for an 8-year-old to carry. Mira gave a small nod and headed toward the corridor that led to the back garden. She didn't take Theo's hand, didn't rest a palm on his shoulder, didn't offer any of the tender gestures other nannies might have tried. Theo didn't like being touched. He flinched whenever anyone attempted to hug him, even his father. That had been the first thing Mira noticed on her first day, when she had brushed his shoulder by accident and watched him jolt as though shocked by electricity. She understood that reflex. She had once been the same. They stopped at a stone bench tucked into the darkest corner of the garden, where the party lights faded into a distant glow. Mira sat at one end, leaving a careful space between herself and Theo. The boy settled at the other, silently studying the Chicago night sky stripped of stars by light pollution. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Sometimes the presence of another person was enough. Mira remembered her first day arriving at the Brennan estate 3 months earlier, when she had stepped off a Greyhound bus at the Chicago terminal with $300 in her coat pocket and a bruise still blooming along her cheekbone. She had run for 3 days and 3 nights from Boston, switching buses 3 times, paying cash for everything, using no credit cards, calling no one. Derek was a cop. He had ways to track her if she wasn't careful. The nanny job at the Brennan estate had been a desperate accident. Mira had spotted the posting pinned to a church notice board she ducked into to escape the rain. They needed someone with a nursing assistant certificate, experience with children, and most of all, someone ready to start immediately with housing provided. Mira hadn't known who the Brennans were. She hadn't known the house she was about to enter was the lair of one of Chicago's largest Mafia organizations. She had only known she needed a place to hide, a job to survive, and a fake name convincing enough that Derek wouldn't find her. Mira Ashford. She had taken the surname from a lawyer's billboard she glimpsed through a bus window. Ashford and Partners. Ordinary enough not to raise questions. Different enough from her real name that Derek couldn't trace her. On the first day, Theo hadn't looked at her. On the second, he had watched her from a distance as though assessing a potential threat. On the third, he had hurled a book in her direction when she tried to read to him. On the 7th, he had stolen glances when he thought she wasn't paying attention. On the 14th, he had stayed in the same room without bolting. On the 21st, he had asked her name for the first time even though he had known it from the beginning. And on the 30th, Theo had left a small folded scrap of paper on her desk and run. Inside was a clumsy drawing. 2 stick figures standing side by side, one tall, one short, and a shaky handwritten line that read Miss Mira and Theo. No hearts, no flowers, no smiling suns, just 2 people beside each other. It had been more than anything Mira had ever received. Now, sitting in the dark garden, Mira felt Theo shift slightly closer. Not touching, just nearer. The boy pulled a protein bar from his jacket pocket that Mira knew he had hidden since breakfast. He snapped it in half and set one piece on the stone bench between them without a word. Mira picked it up. She didn't say thank you. Theo didn't need to hear it. They sat in silence, eating protein bars beneath Chicago's starless sky. 2 battered souls who had found each other inside a house full of shadows and secrets. Mira didn't know that in a few hours she would smash the window of a $200,000 car to save this boy. She didn't know that the act would change everything, dragging her into a war of power she didn't understand the rules of. She only knew that right now, Theo was safe beside her, and that was all that mattered. The peaceful moment didn't last long. The sharp click of high heels echoed across the stone path of the garden, like gunshots announcing the opening of a war. Mira lifted her head and saw Victoria Ashworth striding toward them, the crimson dress sweeping over the grass, her flawless face twisted with anger. Behind her stood two middle-aged women, Mira recognized as the wife of a senator and the daughter of a real estate tycoon, important guests. Victoria was eager to impress. Theo. Victoria spat the boy's name as though it were poison. What did you say? Mira felt Theo stiffen beside her. He didn't answer, only stared down at his polished black shoes. Victoria stopped in front of them, the heavy scent of Chanel No. 5 mixing with champagne on her breath. Mrs. Morrison asked about your mother. Victoria pressed with a shrill edge to her voice. And what did you tell her? You said your mother was dead, and that you don't remember her face. In front of everyone. Do you have any idea how badly you embarrassed me? Mira saw Theo's shoulders tremble. He still didn't look up, but she knew he was biting his lip, the habit he had whenever he tried to contain his emotions. Callum Brennan's wife had been killed 5 years earlier in a gang hit. Theo had been only 3 then. The boy had told the truth, and that truth had cost Victoria face in front of the society women she was courting. Look at me when I'm talking to you, Victoria snarled. Theo didn't move. He had learned that silence was the best form of defense in this house, where every wrong word could become a weapon turned against him. But Victoria didn't accept silence. The hand heavy with diamond rings swung and cracked against Theo's cheek with a sharp sound that split the quiet garden. His head snapped to the side. Mira didn't remember standing up. She only knew that 1 second she had been sitting on the stone bench, and the next she was between Victoria and Theo, back straight, eyes locked on the icy green stare of the most powerful woman in the house. Ms. Ashworth, Mira said, her voice so calm it surprised even her. I'm taking Theo to rest. He needs some private time. Victoria stared at her as though she had grown another head. No one in this estate dared step between her and anything she wanted. No one dared meet her gaze without lowering their eyes. And certainly no one dared protect what she was punishing. Who do you think you are to interfere in my family's business? Victoria asked, her sweetness edged with danger. The women behind her whispered to one another, eyes wide with fascination at the scene unfolding. I'm Theo's caregiver, Mira replied. Not a tremor in her voice, though her heart was pounding like a war drum. And my job is to make sure he's safe and healthy. Safe, Victoria scoffed, taking a step closer. You think you can protect him from me? You're just hired help. You're nothing in this house. Mira didn't retreat. She had retreated enough in her life. From abusive foster families, from Derek whenever he drank. Back and back until she had nearly forgotten who she was. But not today. Not when Theo was standing behind her with a red handprint burning on his cheek. You're right, Miss Ashworth, Mira said, her tone light as air and hard as steel. I'm nothing, but I'm the nothing standing between you and this child, and I'm not moving. The air between the two women thickened until it felt like it could be sliced with a blade. Victoria studied Mira, as though memorizing every line of her face, every strand of hair, every mole. This was how enemies looked at one another. This was how a woman marked a target meant to be destroyed. You'll regret tonight, Victoria said slowly, each word deliberate. Then she turned away, the red dress brushing the grass like a smear of blood, the two society women hurrying after her. Mira remained still until the sound of heels vanished completely. Then she turned to Theo. He was staring at her with wide gray eyes, one hand cupping his stinging cheek, lips parted as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Mira crouched to his level. She didn't ask if it hurt. She didn't ask if he was all right. She simply lifted her hand, stopping a few inches from his face, waiting. And for the first time in 3 months, Theo leaned into her palm. Not far away, hidden in the shadows of a second-floor window, Callum Brennan had seen everything. He had watched Victoria strike his son. He had watched Mira rise to shield Theo. He had witnessed the confrontation between his fiancée and the nameless nanny. And he didn't step in. Not because he didn't care, but because he wanted to see. Wanted to see what Mira would do. Wanted to see whether she would bow before power like everyone else. She didn't, and that changed everything. Mira walked Theo back to his bedroom on the second floor and waited until he had changed into his pajamas and climbed into bed. She didn't speak, only sat in the chair by the window until his breathing evened out and those gray eyes finally closed from exhaustion. Victoria's handprint still burned red against the boy's cheek, a reminder that in this house even children weren't safe. Mira rose, drew the blanket up to Theo's chest, and slipped out of the room. She had to return to the party, at least enough that no one would question her absence. Staff weren't allowed to vanish for long. Staff were meant to be invisible and yet always present. She moved along the second-floor corridor where the wall lamps cast alternating pools of light and shadow like a chessboard. Music from the gala drifted up from below, distant and blurred as though it belonged to another world entirely. Then she heard voices. Mira stopped just outside the study door where warm light spilled through the narrow crack. She recognized Victoria's voice instantly, still sharp but now carrying something else. The thrill of someone holding a secret. "After the wedding, everything will belong to us," Victoria said. "Callum trusts me far too easily. I'm his blood after all." The man who answered made Mira freeze. She knew that voice. Finn Brennan, Callum's younger brother, the family's second in command. A man of 32 with an easy smile. Mira had always sensed hid something wrong beneath it. He seemed too friendly, too open, too unlike his cold older brother. Now she understood why. "What about the boy?" Victoria asked, her tone turning icy. "He's the only heir. We can't let him stand between us and the Brennan Empire." Mira's heart skipped. The boy. They meant Theo. "Accidents happen every day," Finn replied calmly, as though discussing the weather. "An 8-year-old nobody notices. A fall down the stairs. A drowning in the pool. Tragic things happen to children all the time. Callum will grieve for a while, but he'll recover. And you'll be there to comfort him. Give him new children. Our children." Mira clamped a hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. They were planning to kill Theo, not someday in the distant future, but after the wedding, 2 weeks from now. She needed to move, to get away before she was discovered, but her feet felt nailed to the wooden floor. Her thoughts spun with what she'd just heard. Murder, betrayal, an innocent child marked as the target. And she, Mira Ashford, a nameless nanny running from her own past, had somehow become the only person who knew the truth. Victoria's laughter rang out, high and sharp like breaking glass. "I've waited far too long for this, Finn. My father wanted an alliance with the Brennans. But I want more than that. I want everything. And I'll have it." Footsteps shifted inside. They were coming toward the door. Mira retreated, heart hammering as though it might burst from her chest. She glanced around for cover and in that instant slipped into a shadowed recess behind a granite statue set into the wall. The study door opened. Victoria stepped out first, her face restored to the flawless chill of a society heiress. Finn followed, his hand resting on her waist with an intimacy far too familiar for a future sister-in-law and brother-in-law. They passed Mira's hiding place so closely she could smell Chanel No. 5, mingled with Cuban cigars, so closely she could see a smear of red lipstick on Finn's collar. When their footsteps faded at the end of the hall, Mira remained pressed to the cold wall, forcing her breathing to steady. She thought of Theo asleep upstairs with a red mark on his cheek. She thought of Callum standing in the shadows, watching everything without intervening. She thought of her own life, running from one hell into another and somehow landing in the middle of a war of power she didn't understand the rules of. What was she supposed to do? Tell Callum. Would he believe her? A servant accusing his brother and his fiancée? Or would she disappear like so many others who dared stand in the way of people like them? But if she stayed silent, Theo would die. And Mira knew that no matter how hard she tried to deny it, she couldn't let that happen. She couldn't. Mira didn't sleep that night. She lay on the narrow bed in the small staff room, staring at the ceiling while her mind spiraled around what she had overheard. Accidents happen every day. A fall down the stairs. A drowning in the pool. They were planning the death of an 8-year-old child as casually as discussing throwing away something old and unwanted. When the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, Mira had made her decision. She would find a way to speak to Callum. Not today, while the party was still in full swing and the house packed with guests, but soon, before it was too late. The celebration stretched into the following afternoon. A Brennan family tradition Mira had been warned about. The most important guests stayed overnight, continuing their drinking and negotiating shadowy deals in the daylight. Mira went down to the kitchen at 7 a.m. to prepare Theo's breakfast, but he wasn't in his room. She searched the second floor, the first, the garden, and finally spotted Theo standing alone in the corner of the ballroom, where a few guests were still sipping coffee and talking. Victoria stood beside him, one hand gripping Theo's shoulder hard enough to keep him in place, the other holding a glass of champagne. She was presenting him to a circle of society women as though he were a well-trained pet. Mira took in Theo's face. The boy was biting his lip, legs pressed tightly together, his body rigid. She recognized those signs instantly. "Miss Ashworth," Mira said as she approached, forcing calm into her voice. "I need to take Theo for a moment." Victoria turned on her with an icy look. "You again?" "No. The boy is learning how to conduct himself in high society. He needs to stay here. But he needs to use the restroom," Mira said bluntly, ignoring the curious glances from the guests nearby. Victoria's mouth curved in a thin smile. "He needs to learn self-control like a Brennan man. This is an important lesson. Don't interrupt us again." She flicked her hand at Mira as though swatting a fly. Mira wanted to grab this woman by the throat and drag her away from Theo, but she knew that would only make things worse. She met Theo's eyes, trying to send a message without words. Hold on. She would find a way. But 15 minutes later, Mira heard a burst of giggles from a cluster of guests, and Victoria's sharp voice. "Oh my God." The boy wet himself. "Look at this mess. How humiliating. Useless." Mira rushed into the ballroom, but Theo was gone. She saw the wet patch on the marble floor where he had stood, saw the smirking faces of the guests, saw Victoria wiping her hands with a paper napkin in disgust. "Where did he go?" Mira demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "Who cares?" Victoria shrugged. "He needs time to be ashamed of himself." Mira didn't wait. She bolted from the room, searching everywhere. Theo's bedroom was empty. The bathroom was empty. The garden was empty. Then she remembered the underground garage, the quietest place in the house, the place Theo would hide to escape everyone. She ran down the stairs toward the basement, footsteps slapping against concrete, and she saw him through the window of Callum's sleek black Bentley Continental. Theo was curled in the back seat, knees drawn to his chest, face buried in his hands. He was crying. Mira sprinted to the car and yanked the door handle. It didn't budge. She tried the other side. Locked. Every door was locked. "Theo!" Mira pounded on the glass. "Can you hear me? Open the door." The boy lifted his head, eyes swollen and red. He reached for the release button, but nothing happened. Child locks. The doors could only be opened from the outside. "Miss Mira." Theo's voice drifted through the glass, thin and panicked. "I can't open it. It's too hot." Mira peered inside. The dashboard temperature climbed steadily. 90 degrees. 100. 110. July in Chicago. A garage without air conditioning. A black car absorbing heat like an oven. She glanced up and saw it. A security camera in the corner of the garage, its red light blinking. And she understood. Victoria had seen Theo run in here. She had locked the car remotely with a phone app. She was watching everything unfold through the cameras. This wasn't an accident. This was a test. A fall down the stairs. A drowning in the pool. A child suffocating in a car under the sun. Accidents happen every day. "Miss Mira," Theo's voice had faded to a whisper. "I'm dizzy. I can't breathe." Mira stared through the window. Theo's face had gone from flushed to pale, sweat streaming down his forehead, gray eyes glazing over. He was slipping into unconsciousness. There was no time to look for keys, no time to call anyone. Mira scanned the garage and spotted a brick lying beside a stack of construction materials in the corner. She didn't hesitate. The brick felt heavy in Mira's hand. She didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't calculate consequences. She just swung and struck. The glass exploded outward in a small blast, shards slicing into her skin as blood rushed down her arm. She didn't feel pain. There wasn't time to feel pain. Mira shoved her arm through the shattered frame, unlocked the door from inside, and wrenched it open. Heat slammed into her face like a blow from hell. Theo lay slumped in the back seat, eyes sealed shut, lips cracked and dry, skin gray as ash. He didn't react when Mira dragged him from the car, didn't make a sound when she laid him on the cold concrete. He wasn't breathing. The boy wasn't breathing. Mira tilted his head back and opened his airway the way she'd been trained as a nursing assistant. She sealed her mouth over his and blew air in, then planted both hands on his chest and pressed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe, press, breathe, press. Blood dripped from her hand onto Theo's white shirt, blooming like dead petals. "Please," Mira whispered, then shouted. "Please breathe. Someone help me. Call an ambulance." Her cries ricocheted through the underground garage, echoing off concrete walls like the sound of desperation itself. Then Theo coughed. A thin rasp at first, followed by a frantic gulp of air, then a small groan. He was alive. Mira pulled him into her arms, clutching him as though he might vanish if she let go. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with blood and sweat, soaking into the boy's hair as he trembled against her chest. She didn't hear footsteps. She didn't notice movement in the garage. She only knew Theo was breathing, was alive, and that was all that mattered, until she lifted her head and saw him. Callum Brennan stood 10 paces away, frozen like a stone statue. He didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't rush forward. He just stood there and stared. At the Bentley with its shattered window, at the glittering shards scattered across the concrete, at Mira sitting in a pool of blood with Theo in her arms, and his gray eyes, the eyes Mira had seen empty the night before, were now burning with something she couldn't name. Not anger. Anger was loud and explosive and simple to understand. This was something else, colder, deeper, more dangerous. The stillness of a man who'd crossed beyond ordinary emotion and entered territory known only to those who had killed. Callum stepped closer. One step at a time, slow, deliberate. Mira didn't know whether to be afraid or to explain. She didn't know what he was thinking or feeling or planning. She only tightened her hold on Theo, as though her body could become a shield. Callum stopped in front of her. He dropped to one knee, and for the first time Mira saw a crack in that icy armor. His hands shook as he reached for Theo's face, fingers skimming the boy's cheek, checking breath and pulse with the reflexes of someone accustomed to deciding who still lived and who didn't. "My son," Callum said, his voice raw as though the words were being dragged from his throat with iron hooks. "What happened to my son? He was locked in the car," Mira answered, her voice still quivering from the shock of it all. "I found him when he was barely breathing. The doors were locked. I had to break the window." "Who?" One word. But the way Callum spoke, it made the air in the garage drop several degrees. "Who locked my son in that car?" Mira opened her mouth and hesitated. She thought of Victoria, of the security camera, of the conversation she'd overheard the night before, of the plan to kill Theo after the wedding. But she had no proof, only her word against that of Callum's fiancé and his brother. She was only a nanny. She was nothing in this house. "I don't know," Mira lied. "I only found him in the car." Callum looked at her, straight into her eyes, as though reading every thought and secret and lie she was trying to hide. And she knew he didn't believe her. "You're hiding something," he said, not as a question but a verdict. Yet instead of forcing her to speak, he turned back to his son. His hands that had crushed throats and ordered executions, now lifted Theo's head as gently as though the boy were made of glass. The wail of an ambulance siren rose from above. Someone had called. Callum didn't move. He stayed kneeling there beside Mira and Theo, amid blood and broken glass. And in that moment, Mira saw what the world was never meant to see. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago was crying. Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 3 a.m. was as silent as a luxurious morgue. White fluorescent lights poured down the long corridors, reflecting off tiles polished to a shine, antiseptic mingling with the stale scent of cold coffee drifting from the nurse's station. Callum Brennan sat in the hard plastic chair beside his son's bed, motionless as carved stone. He had been there for 8 hours, without eating, without drinking, without speaking a single word to anyone. Tommy Reeves, his most loyal bodyguard, stood watch outside the room, with 2 more men stationed at the end of the hall. No one was allowed inside except doctors and nurses, not even Victoria, especially not Victoria. Theo lay in the hospital bed, his small body nearly swallowed by IV lines and heart monitors. The gray had faded from his face. His lips were no longer cracked the way they had been hours earlier, but his eyes remained closed and his breathing still shallow. The doctor had said he would be fine. 2nd-degree heat shock and severe dehydration, but no permanent brain damage. 15 more minutes, the doctor had said while looking Callum straight in the eye, and his son would have had no chance. That woman saved his life. That woman. Callum turned his head toward the other bed in the room where Mira sat propped against the mattress, both arms wrapped in white bandages from wrist to elbow. She hadn't lain down despite the doctor insisting she rest. She hadn't slept either. Her amber eyes were locked on Theo, as though she feared that if she blinked, he would disappear. 17 stitches in her right hand, 9 in her left. A deep gash across her palm that had nearly severed a tendon. She had smashed the car window with a heavy brick, her hands shredded by the exploding shards in her desperation, not caring that the deep gashes might leave her unable to fully use them again. For his son, a child who wasn't hers, a child she had cared for only 3 months, a child she had no obligation to sacrifice anything for. Callum didn't understand. He had spent 37 years in a world where every action had a price, every kindness carried motive, every sacrifice demanded repayment. No one did anything without expecting something in return. No one. And yet this woman, A nameless nanny with a false name he knew was false. A woman running from something he had not yet uncovered, the woman who had dared place herself between his fiancé and his son only hours earlier, had nearly destroyed her hands to save Theo. Why? Callum wanted to ask. He wanted to stand, cross the room, look straight into her eyes and demand why. Why did she do it? What did she want from him? What was she calculating? But he didn't ask. He said nothing at all. He only sat there watching her, trying to read her the way he read an opponent across a negotiation table. And she didn't look back. She didn't try to catch his gaze, didn't attempt to start a conversation, didn't do anything to draw his attention. She only watched Theo. As though the boy were the only thing that mattered in that room. As though Callum didn't exist. It unsettled him, not because he needed her attention, but because he wasn't accustomed to being ignored. He was Callum Brennan. People didn't ignore him. They feared him or flattered him or hated him, but they didn't ignore him. 4 a.m, Mira finally drifted into sleep, her head tilted to one side, dark brown hair spilling over her shoulder, her face softening in rest. She looked younger when she slept, younger and more fragile, and for the first time Callum noticed the scars. Small, almost invisible unless you looked closely. Round burn marks along her wrist just above the white bandages. Cigarette burns. He recognized them because he had seen the same marks on the bodies of people who had been tortured. Someone had done that to her. Someone had pressed lit cigarettes into her skin, maybe many times, maybe over years. And she had survived, had kept standing, had run to Chicago with a false name and a past she was trying to bury, had still been willing to shatter a car window to save a child who wasn't hers. Callum turned back to Theo. The boy still slept, chest rising and falling steadily, the heart monitor chiming in a steady rhythm. His son was alive because of that woman. He should say thank you. That was what ordinary people did. But Callum Brennan wasn't ordinary, and gratitude, to him, was too small for what she had done. He wouldn't say thank you. He would do far more than that. He would find out who she really was, what she was running from, and he would destroy whoever had left those scars on her skin. That was how Callum Brennan said thank you. 2 days later, Theo was discharged from the hospital. Callum brought his son back to the estate in silence, settled the boy into his bedroom with Mira keeping watch beside him, then vanished into his study. He hadn't slept since that night. He didn't need to. Rage coursed through his veins like adrenaline, keeping him sharper than any coffee ever could. Tommy had delivered every second of security footage from the 24 hours leading up to the incident. Callum sat alone in the study, the laptop screen washing his face in a blue glow, like light from hell itself. He watched Victoria force Theo to stand and greet guests in the ballroom. He watched her refuse to let the boy go to the restroom. He watched Theo flee the room with wet trousers and a face burning with shame. He watched the child run down to the underground garage, open the Bentley, and climb inside. And then he watched Victoria. She stood in the corridor, phone in hand, staring at the screen with a smile Callum would never forget, the smile of a predator watching prey step into a trap. She pressed a button. On the garage feed, the Bentley's lights blinked once, signaling the remote lock. Victoria knew Theo was inside. She had deliberately sealed him in. She lingered there for 30 seconds, staring at the screen where she could watch the garage cameras, then smiled and walked away. She didn't call anyone. She didn't go down to check. She did nothing at all. Callum rewound the footage, watched the smile again, rewound, watched it again, rewound, watched it again. Each time, his fury didn't explode. It condensed, thickening into something darker, colder, far more dangerous. He lifted the phone and dialed. "Bring Victoria to my study. Now." 15 minutes later, Victoria entered with the confidence of a queen. She'd changed into a new dress, flawless makeup in place, platinum blonde hair smoothed to perfection, not a hint of fear in her expression. "My dear Callum," she smiled as she approached him. "I heard Theo's back home. Thank goodness he's fine. I've been worried these past few days." Callum didn't rise. He didn't invite her to sit. He only turned the laptop screen toward her and pressed play. Victoria watched. The smile on her lips melted like snow in sunlight. Color drained from her face as recognition dawned. Her image staring at the phone. Her image smiling. Her image locking the car. This was an accident. Victoria rushed out, her voice pitched higher than usual. "I didn't know Theo was inside. I only locked the car because there were so many guests in the house. I never meant to." Callum lifted one hand, a small gesture. Victoria fell silent instantly, as though someone had switched her voice off. He stood, slowly, every movement perfectly controlled, and walked toward her. With each step forward, she retreated until her back hit the wall. He stopped a hand's breadth away, close enough for her to see the muscles twitching along his jaw, close enough to smell whiskey on his breath, close enough to look into his gray eyes and glimpse her own death reflected there. "You think I'm stupid," Callum said, his voice light as a breeze and cold as the Arctic winter. "You think I don't know what you want? Power. Money. The Brennan Empire. You think I don't know you're sleeping with Finn?" Victoria's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, but he continued. "You think I don't know what the two of you are planning after the wedding? Accidents happen every day, don't they? A fall down the stairs, a drowning in the pool." Victoria trembled. The confidence was gone. The victorious smile was gone. She looked like what she truly was, a predator who had just realized she was standing in front of a larger one. "Callum, I can explain," she whispered. "The wedding will still happen," Callum said. Victoria blinked, thrown off balance. She hadn't expected that. "Really?" she asked, a flicker of hope sparking in her eyes. Callum smiled, and that smile was more terrifying than rage. "The wedding will still happen," he repeated. "You'll walk to the altar at St. Patrick's in front of 500 guests, including your father. You'll wear white and carry flowers. You'll stand there and wait." He tilted his head, steel cold in his gaze. "And then you'll learn what justice looks like when power decides." Victoria wanted to ask what he meant, but Callum had already turned away. He paused at the door without looking back. "Oh, and one more thing," he said. "If you or Finn go anywhere near Theo or Mira again before the wedding day, I won't wait for the church. I'll bury both of you in the rose garden and plant black roses on top." The door shut behind him. Victoria stood alone in the study, shaking, and for the first time in her life, she understood what real fear meant. 3 days after Theo was released from the hospital, Mira received a message from Mrs. Ruth Chen, the estate's housekeeper. "Mr. Brennan wants to see you in his study at 8 this evening." No explanation, no option to refuse. Mira stood in front of the black oak door of the study, her heart beating faster than usual. She didn't know what Callum wanted. Maybe he had discovered her false name. Maybe he intended to fire her for destroying a $200,000 car. Maybe he wanted to ask about what she had overheard that night, about Victoria and Finn, about the plot she was trying to hide. She drew a slow breath and knocked. "Come in." Callum's voice came from inside, low and cold as ever. Mira pushed the door open and stepped inside. Callum Brennan's study was a fusion of power and shadow. Dark walnut paneling lined the walls. Towering shelves filled with leather-bound books no one likely ever read. A massive mahogany desk set before a wide window overlooking the rose garden. Callum sat behind it, the glow of a desk lamp casting sharp shadows across his face, emphasizing the scar along his jaw and his unreadable gray eyes. "Sit." He gestured to the chair opposite him, not an invitation, a command. Mira sat, spine straight, hands folded on her thighs. She didn't bow her head or avert her gaze. She had learned that in this house lowering your eyes marked you as weak, and the weak were swallowed whole. "How's your hand?" Callum asked. The unexpected question made Mira blink. "Healing," she answered briefly. "The doctor says there's no permanent damage." "Good." Callum nodded, then he went quiet, studying her the way he might evaluate a purchase before deciding whether to make it. "I want to offer you a new position," he said at last. "Full-time nanny for Theo. You'll move into the room next to his, have access to every area of the house connected to my son's care, triple your current salary, full medical coverage, and the protection of the Brennan family." Mira didn't respond right away. She knew in this world nothing was free. "The protection of the Brennan family," she repeated. "What does that mean?" "It means anyone who harms you answers to me," Callum said without hesitation. "It means you'll be safe." Heat rushed to Mira's face. He knew. He knew she was running from someone even if he didn't yet know the details. This wasn't kindness. This was a transaction. "I don't need protection," she said, her voice harder than she intended. "I only need a job." "You're lying." Callum leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "The cigarette burns on your wrist weren't an accident. The name Mira Ashford didn't exist before 6 months ago. You arrived in Chicago alone with $300 in your pocket and applied at the first house willing to take you without asking too many questions. You're running, Mira, or whatever your real name is, and whoever you're running from is dangerous. Mira clenched her hands on her thighs. She wanted to stand and walk out, but she knew she couldn't. She had stepped into Callum Brennan's world, and nobody left that world without his permission. "What do you want from me?" she asked flatly. "What do you really want?" Callum studied her for a long moment before answering. "I want you beside Theo," he said. "My son trusts you. For the first time in 5 years, he trusts someone other than me. You saved his life. Not for money, not out of obligation, but because you cared. I don't understand why, but I don't need to. I just need you to stay." Mira fell silent. She thought of Theo, of the sadness in his gray eyes, of the way he had leaned into her palm in the dark garden that night, of the half-protein bar he had shared with her. She couldn't leave him. Not now. When she knew what Victoria and Finn were planning, "I have conditions," she said. Callum raised an eyebrow, clearly unused to anyone placing conditions on him. "Go on." "First, I don't report to Victoria about anything involving Theo. I report only to you or Mrs. Chen. Second, if I see anyone in this house harm Theo, whoever it is, I have the right to act to protect him without asking permission. Third, when I decide to leave, you'll let me go. No tracking, no retaliation, no strings." Callum looked at her, and for the first time Mira saw something different in those cold gray eyes. Not respect, because men like Callum didn't respect anyone, but perhaps recognition, the recognition reserved for an equal adversary. "Agreed," he said. "But I have one condition as well. You'll tell me your real name. Not now. When you're ready." Mira stood to leave. She paused at the door and turned back. "My real name is Mira," she said. "Only the last name is fake." Then she walked out of the study, leaving Callum alone in the shadows, watching her with an expression even he didn't understand. That night, after Mira left the study, Callum summoned Tommy. His most loyal bodyguard stood before the desk, waiting for orders with the patience of a man who had served the Brennan family for 15 years. "I want everything on her," Callum said, his voice giving nothing away. "Her real name, her past, her family, why she came to Chicago, everything." Tommy nodded and vanished into the night. He didn't ask why, didn't question his boss's motives. That was why Callum trusted him more than anyone else in the organization, including Finn, especially Finn. 3 days later, Tommy placed a thick folder on Callum's desk. Inside was a woman's entire life compressed into paper, photographs, and police reports. Callum opened it and began to read. Her real name was Mira Collins, born in a small town called Brockton, Massachusetts, about 40 minutes by car from Boston. Her mother was addicted to heroin and abandoned her when she was 4, disappearing into the rehab system and never returning. Her father wasn't listed on the birth certificate. From age 4 to 18, Mira passed through 12 different foster homes. Callum read the social worker reports, the dry notes about little Mira Collins being removed from the 3rd foster family for suspected physical abuse, from the 5th for neglect, from the 7th for signs of sexual abuse by an older boy in the household. He studied the attached photographs. A skinny girl with oversized amber eyes and a narrow face, staring into the camera the way you stared at an enemy. Not smiling, not crying, only the emptiness of a child who had learned that feelings were a luxury she wasn't allowed. At 18, Mira aged out of the system. She worked days at a fast food restaurant and studied nights for a nursing assistant certificate. It took her 4 years, but she earned it. Then she met Derek Cole. Callum examined Derek's photograph in the file. A man of 32, sandy blonde hair, blue eyes, the charming smile of a predator who knew how to disguise himself. A detective with the Boston Police Department assigned to organized crime. On paper, Derek Cole was a model citizen, a respected lawman. But the next pages told a different story. 5 domestic violence reports filed by Mira, all dismissed or never investigated. Derek was a cop. He knew how to make reports disappear. A restraining order issued and revoked 3 days later for lack of evidence. Hospital records showed Mira admitted 7 times in 4 years with broken ribs, sprained wrists, mild head trauma, and countless bruises. Each time she claimed it was an accident, falling down the stairs, slipping in the shower, walking into a door. Lies both she and the doctors knew were lies, but no one did anything because her husband was a police officer. Callum turned to the final pages. 6 months ago, Mira Collins vanished. She withdrew her entire savings, $327, left behind her phone, credit cards, and anything traceable. She boarded a Greyhound bus and disappeared from Boston. Derek filed a missing person report, but Boston police turned up nothing, because they weren't looking in the right direction. But Derek hadn't stopped. Tommy had uncovered proof that Derek was using criminal connections to hunt her down, and one of those connections was the Ashworth family, Victoria's father. Callum closed the folder. He sat in the darkness of the study, gray eyes fixed on nothing. He thought about the cigarette burn scars on Mira's wrist. He thought about the way she never let anyone stand behind her, the way she always chose seats facing exits, the way she flinched at every loud sound but tried to hide the reflex behind a mask of calm. He thought about how she stood straight-backed before Victoria, didn't bow, didn't retreat, even knowing she was confronting someone who could destroy her life with a single phone call. She hadn't run because she was weak. She had run because she was strong enough to know that was the only way to survive. Callum picked up the phone and called Tommy again. "I want 2 men on her 24/7, he said, without her knowing. "Don't let anyone near her without my permission. And get me everything on Derek Cole. Where he is, what he's doing, what he's planning." "What about Victoria and the Ashworths?" Tommy asked. "If Derek is in contact with them, let them think they're in control," Callum replied. "Sometimes the best prey is the kind that doesn't know it's being hunted." He ended the call and looked back at the folder on his desk. He wouldn't tell Mira what he knew. He wouldn't confront her about the past, about the false name, about Derek. She had fought alone her entire life, and he wouldn't insult her by offering pity, but he would protect her, not because she was fragile and needed saving, but because she had protected the most precious thing in his world, and Callum Brennan always repaid his debts. 1 week had passed since Mira moved into the room beside Theo's. She had adjusted to the new rhythm, waking at 6 every morning to prepare his breakfast, taking him to the most prestigious private school in Chicago, picking him up in the afternoon and helping with homework, reading to him before bed. But night was different. Night was when the nightmares came. Mira jolted awake at 2 in the morning with a scream trapped in her throat and her nightgown soaked in sweat. In the dream, Derek had found her. He stood at the far end of the Brennan hallway, that familiar smile on his lips, a burning cigarette between his fingers. "You think you can run from me, Mira?" His voice echoed inside her skull like a death knell. "You belong to me. Forever." She sat up in bed, forcing her breathing to slow. The room was pitch dark, moonlight slipping through the curtain gap and painting pale streaks across the wooden floor. She knew she wouldn't fall back asleep. Not tonight. Mira slipped on a robe and left the room, bare feet silent on the thick carpet. She intended to go down to the kitchen for a glass of warm milk, a habit left over from her years in foster care when warm milk had been the only luxury she could give herself on sleepless nights. But when she stepped into the kitchen, she realized she wasn't the only one awake. Callum Brennan sat on a bar stool by the marble island, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the bottle of 30-year-old Macallan in front of him already more than half gone. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, only a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, tie loosened, dark hair slightly rumpled as though he'd dragged his hands through it more than once. He looked like an ordinary man rather than a mafia boss, and somehow that was even more unsettling. Mira paused in the doorway, unsure whether to advance or retreat. Callum lifted his head and looked at her. His gray eyes weren't cold the way they usually were. They were tired, clouded like smoke. "Nightmare?" he asked, his voice rough with whiskey. Mira didn't answer. She walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and took out the milk carton. She could feel his gaze tracking every movement, but she didn't look back. She poured the milk into a glass, set it in the microwave, and waited. The low hum of the machine was the only sound in the silent room. "Sit down," Callum said when the microwave stopped. Not quite an invitation. Not exactly an order either. Something in between. Mira took the warm milk and sat on the bar stool 2 seats away from him, far enough to feel safe, close enough to talk. She sipped, letting the heat slide down her throat and soothe her twisting stomach. "You know who I am," Callum said after a stretch of silence. "I know you know. You've been here long enough to hear, to see, to understand. So why are you still here?" "Because of Theo," Mira answered without hesitation. Callum studied her, a faint, ironic smile touching his mouth. "Only because of Theo. Only because of Theo." He nodded and took another drink. They sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Mira set her glass down and met his eyes directly. "Have you killed people?" No circling, no hesitation, no fear. The question dropped between them like a stone into still water, sending invisible ripples outward. Callum didn't look surprised. He didn't look offended either. He simply held her gaze, gray eyes locked with amber in the dim kitchen light of 2 in the morning. "When necessary," he replied. His voice carried no emotion, as though he were answering a question about the weather. "What does necessary mean?" Mira pressed. "It means when someone threatens my family, my organization, or the people I protect." Callum set his glass down and looked at her. "I don't kill innocents. I don't kill women or children. I don't kill people just because they irritate me. But if someone tries to destroy what I've built, if someone threatens my son or my people, then yes, I'll kill them. And I won't lose sleep over it." Mira knew she should be afraid. She was sitting in a kitchen at 2 a.m. with a man calmly admitting to murder, a mafia boss, someone the entire city of Chicago feared, but she wasn't afraid, because she understood. She had lived with a different kind of killer, a killer in a police uniform, a man who killed with fists and cigarettes and soft words before violence. Derek hadn't needed reasons to cause pain. He'd only needed a mood. Callum, on the other hand, had rules, and in the world Mira had survived, rules were a luxury. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Every day," Callum replied, and for the first time she heard something else in his voice. Not weakness, but truth. "I regret that my wife died in a war I started. I regret that my son has to grow up in this house with a father like me. I regret it every day, but I don't stop, because if I stop, someone else takes my place, and they won't have any rules at all." They sat in silence until Callum's whiskey glass was empty and Mira's milk had gone cold. No promises, no tender understanding, no romantic moment. Just two people battered by life, sitting beside each other in the dark, sharing truths they couldn't speak to anyone else. And sometimes, that was more than any declaration of love. 3 days after the 2 a.m. conversation in the kitchen, Mira still couldn't stop thinking about what Callum had said. When necessary, he killed. When necessary, she knew what that meant. She wasn't naive. She'd lived in this house long enough to understand that the closed-door meetings in the study weren't about real estate deals. But knowing and seeing were two entirely different things. That night, Mira woke to Theo crying in his sleep. She hurried into his room, sat beside the bed, and held his hand until the nightmare passed. When he drifted back to sleep, she realized she was thirsty. She left the room and headed down the stairs, intending to go to the kitchen as usual, but she took the wrong turn. The Brennan estate was a maze of identical corridors, and in the darkness Mira went right instead of left. She knew she was heading toward the basement when she heard the sounds. A groan, the crack of bone, a voice begging. She should have turned back. She knew she should have turned back, but her feet kept moving as though they belonged to someone else, until she stood before the iron door to the basement, slightly ajar. Dull yellow light spilled through the gap, and Mira looked inside. The cellar was lit by a single overhead bulb, casting light and shadow the way a Caravaggio painting did. In the center of the room, a man was tied to a chair, his face ruined by blood and bruises, his white shirt soaked red, and standing in front of him was Callum Brennan. Callum had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. Blood smeared across his hands as he held a small knife. He wasn't shouting, wasn't threatening, didn't look unhinged. He was calm, like someone performing a medical procedure, every movement precise and deliberate. "You sold information to the Ashworths," Callum said, his tone gentle, as though speaking to a friend. "You thought I didn't know. You thought you could play both sides." The man sobbed, tears mixing with blood as they slid down his chin. "I'm sorry, boss. I have a family. They threaten my family. Please, give me another chance." Callum tilted his head as though weighing the plea, then lifted the knife and cut. The scream tore through the basement, piercing straight through Mira's bones like an ice needle. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to turn away, unable to shut her eyes. She watched Callum torture him, watched blood drip onto the concrete floor, watched the man fade toward unconsciousness from pain. And she didn't scream. She didn't run for the police, didn't faint, didn't do anything a normal woman would do after witnessing something like this. She just stood there and watched, because deep inside, in a dark place she'd never admitted existed, she understood. She understood the necessity of violence. She understood that sometimes, to protect what you loved, you had to become what the world called a monster. She had once wished she'd had the strength to do this to Derek, wished she could make him hurt the way he'd hurt her, wished she could be the one holding the knife instead of the one being cut. Callum lifted his head as though sensing her presence. His gray eyes met her amber ones through the narrow crack in the door, and they stared at each other in a moment that stretched into eternity. Callum didn't look surprised, didn't look ashamed, didn't try to explain or justify anything. He just looked at her, the knife still in his hand, blood still dripping to the floor. and Mira simply turned and walked away. She didn't run. She walked slowly, evenly, as though she'd just seen something entirely ordinary. She climbed the stairs, moved down the corridor, went into her room, and locked the door. She sat on the bed in the darkness, fingers interlaced, forcing her breathing under control. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She just sat there and thought about Callum with blood on his hands, thought about Derek with her blood on his fists, thought about the difference between the two men and whether that difference mattered, thought about herself, the woman who had watched someone being tortured without flinching. What had she become? Or had she always been this way, only never given the chance to find out? The next morning, Mira woke at 6 as usual. She showered, put on her uniform, and went downstairs to prepare Theo's breakfast. Fried eggs, toast, fresh orange juice. She set the plate in front of him with a gentle smile, cut his food into small pieces, reminded him to drink his milk. "Miss Mira?" Theo asked, gray eyes studying her with the heightened perception of a child who had lived too long in shadows. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," Mira answered, and her voice didn't tremble. "Eat your breakfast or you'll be late for school." She didn't look toward Callum when he entered the kitchen 15 minutes later. She didn't look at his hands, now clean, bearing no trace of the night before. She just kept clearing the table, washing dishes, living the ordinary life she had built in this house. Because that was how Mira survived. By moving forward, no matter what she'd seen the night before, no matter what she had become. 1 week after the night in the basement, everything collapsed. Mira was taking Theo to school like every other morning when she noticed the tabloid Chicago Tribune display outside a convenience store. Brennan, kingpin and mystery lover, betrayed fiancé before upcoming wedding. Beneath the headline was a distant photograph, but clear enough to recognize. Callum and Mira stood beside each other in the estate garden, his head inclined toward her as though saying something, his hand resting lightly at her elbow. An innocent moment, yet through a paparazzo's lens it looked like a secret affair. Mira felt the blood drain from her face. "Miss Mira." Theo tugged her hand, gray eyes anxious. "Why do you look so pale?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." Mira swallowed, forcing her voice steady. "Let's go, or we'll be late for school." But everything was wrong. When Mira returned to the estate after dropping Theo off, she found Victoria standing in the living room with the paper in her hand, a victorious smile on her lips. She wore a snow-white dress that contrasted perfectly with the venom in her gaze as she looked at Mira like an insect about to be crushed. "Look who's here!" Victoria flicked the paper through the air. "The country girl from Boston thinks she can steal another woman's husband. I told you, Callum. I told you she shouldn't have been hired." Mira stayed still, said nothing. She saw Callum by the window with his back to them, silent as stone. He didn't look at her, didn't defend her, didn't speak. But Victoria wasn't finished. She stepped closer, lowering her voice into a honeyed whisper thick with poison. "Who do you think you are?" she asked. "Do you think you can keep running forever? Mira Collins?" Mira's heart skipped. Collins. Her real name. Victoria knew. She'd known. "Oh, you thought you could hide forever," Victoria sneered. "Derek misses you very much. He's been looking for you for 6 months, and now he knows exactly where you are." Mira wanted to run, to turn and flee this house, this city, this life unraveling around her. But her legs wouldn't move. Derek was coming. He knew where she was. Victoria had sold her to him, probably through her father, Malcolm Ashworth. The man Tommy had warned was connected to Derek. Everything was a trap. The paper, the photo, the scandal. All of it meant to distract while Derek closed in. "You have 1 hour to pack and leave," Victoria said sweetly, honey laced with venom. 1 hour before I call the police and report you as an illegal employee with falsified documents. You walk out or you're dragged out. You don't get to expel anyone from my house." Callum cut in, his voice steel cold. He had turned around, gray eyes fixed on Victoria with something even worse than fury. Victoria paled, then steadied herself. "You can't protect her forever, Callum. Who is she?" "A servant with a scandal-soaked past. And I'm your future wife, Malcolm Ashworth's daughter. The most important alliance the Brennan family has. Choose, her or me." The room fell silent as a tomb. Mira looked at Callum, then at Victoria, then down at her own hands, the faint scars still visible from smashing the car window to save Theo. She was tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being a burden to anyone else. "I resign," Mira said, her voice so calm it startled even her. "I'll pack and leave within an hour." Victoria smiled, her eyes glowing with triumph. But Callum only stared at Mira with something she couldn't read. "No," he said. A single word, yet it thundered through the room. "Mira, you're not going anywhere. No one gets to drive my people out. No one." 3 days after the newspaper scandal, Callum forbade Mira from leaving the estate alone. But Theo needed his routine dental appointment, and she refused to let the boy go with a stranger. So she convinced Callum she would be fine, that she had survived 27 years without protection, that Derek wouldn't dare act in broad daylight in a city that wasn't his territory. Callum didn't agree, yet he didn't stop her either. He only studied her with unreadable gray eyes and said 2 words, "Be careful." Mira took Theo to the dentist, waited in the clinic for an hour, then decided to walk him through Grant Park before heading home. That was the first mistake. The second was not noticing the white van that had followed them since they left the office. The park that afternoon was crowded as usual. Children running across the grass, couples strolling along Lake Michigan, elderly people feeding pigeons from stone benches, and Mira and Theo were heading down a narrow path toward the playground when she heard that voice, the one she had heard in nightmares for 6 months. "Hello, Mira." She froze, every cell in her body screaming for her to run, but her feet felt nailed to the pavement as she turned and saw him. Derek Cole standing 5 steps away, the same charming smile, the same icy blue eyes, the same relaxed confidence of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to go. Wearing a brown leather jacket with his hands in his pockets, looking like an ordinary father enjoying the park. Mira knew better. She knew the hand in that pocket could crush her throat. "You thought you could run from me forever." Derek moved closer, his voice soft as though speaking to a former lover. "You belong to me, Mira. You always belonged to me. 6 months I searched for you. 6 months I couldn't sleep thinking about you. And now I've found you." Mira pulled Theo behind her, the instinct to shield the child overpowering the terror, tightening her chest. "Miss Mira," Theo whispered, shaking. "Who is that man?" "No one, sweetheart," Mira said, forcing calm into her voice. "We're leaving right now." But when she turned to run, Derek was faster, grabbing her arm and yanking her back, his fingers clamping so hard she knew bruises would bloom by morning. "If there was a morning, you're not going anywhere," Derek snarled as the polite mask fell away to reveal the monster beneath. "You're coming home with me right now, and if you fight me, I'll hurt the boy in front of you." Mira looked at Theo, trembling, gray eyes wide the same way they'd been the night he was locked inside the car, and she knew she couldn't let him be harmed. Couldn't. "All right," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll go with you, but leave the boy out of it. He has nothing to do with us." Derek smiled, the grin of a victor, loosened his grip on her arm, and reached for Theo. And that was when Tommy appeared. Mira never saw where he came from, only a blur of motion, and then Derek was face down in the grass with his arm wrenched behind his back, his cheek pressed to the ground. "Are you all right, Miss Ashford?" Tommy asked calmly, as though he had merely picked up something she dropped instead of disabling a former police officer. Mira nodded without being able to speak, pulled Theo into her arms, held the sobbing child tight, and for the first time in 6 months, allowed herself to cry as well. 2 hours later, she sat in Callum's study with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched, listening to Tommy report everything, watching the cold fury in Callum's gray eyes, waiting for him to order Derek killed the way he had killed the traitor in the basement that night. But it didn't happen. Instead, Callum made a phone call, and 20 minutes later, 2 FBI agents arrived at the Brennan estate to arrest Derek Cole on charges of corruption, abuse of authority, and ties to the Ashworth crime organization, evidence Callum supplied that would put Derek away for at least 20 years. When everyone had left and the mansion had fallen quiet again, Mira looked at Callum in confusion and asked why. "Why didn't you kill him? You could have. I know you could have." Callum studied her, his gray eyes softening just a fraction, enough for her to notice. "Because you didn't want to see blood," he said. Mira blinked, shaken. "I didn't. I never told you that." He stepped closer until she could smell wood and whiskey on him and said, "I know. I saw you that night in the basement. I saw the way you looked. You weren't afraid, but you didn't want to see more blood either. You've already seen too much." Then he stopped, and for the first time Mira saw something like gentleness in the eyes of the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago. "I won't become what you're running from. Not with you." She couldn't speak, could only stand there with tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in her life she felt safe. 1 week before the wedding, Mira made a decision. She couldn't stay here anymore. Not because of Derek. He was sitting in federal prison awaiting trial and wouldn't be getting out for at least 2 decades. Not because of Victoria, who still looked at Mira like an enemy but hadn't dared make a move since Callum warned her. Not because of any danger from the outside, but because of the danger within. Mira was in love with Callum Brennan. She didn't know when it had started. Maybe it was the 2 a.m. conversation in the kitchen when he admitted he regretted things every day. Maybe it was the moment he'd looked at her through the crack in the basement door and hadn't tried to justify what he was doing. Maybe it was when he handed Derek to the FBI instead of killing him, simply because he knew she didn't want to see more blood. Or maybe it had begun long before that, the first time she'd seen him cry beside Theo's hospital bed, the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago, with silent tears sliding down his cheeks. But Callum was about to marry Victoria. In 7 days, he would stand at the altar in Street, Patrick's church, and speak vows to another woman. Not because he loved her, but because it was a transaction, an alliance, the way his world functioned. And Mira was only the nanny. She didn't belong in that world. She shouldn't want to belong in that world. She wrote the letter at midnight, when the entire estate had fallen asleep, her handwriting trembling across the white page as she explained to Theo why she had to leave. Promised him she'd always remember him, that he was the bravest child she'd ever known, that he deserved to be loved more than anyone in the world. She didn't write to Callum. She didn't know what to say. She folded the letter, placed it on Theo's pillow, then returned to her room to pack. There wasn't much to take. She'd arrived with $300 in a small suitcase, and she would leave with no more than that. She hadn't collected this month's pay, and she would leave it behind. She didn't want to carry anything that belonged to this house, anything that reminded her of him. Mira carried the suitcase down the stairs at 2 a.m, her steps as light as a cat's on the thick carpet. She was nearly at the front door when the darkness ahead of her shifted. Callum leaned against the doorway, arms folded across his chest, gray eyes fixed on her in the shadows. He wasn't wearing a suit, only a black shirt and trousers, his hair slightly rumpled, as though he hadn't slept either. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice low and tired. Mira stopped, fingers tightening around the handle of the suitcase. "Away from here. Away from this life. Away from you." "Why?" "Because I can't stay and watch you marry her." The answer slipped from her lips before she could stop it. Raw truth without disguise or excuse. She was too tired to lie anymore. Callum didn't speak. He only looked at her, gray eyes deep as a winter lake, impossible to read. Then he moved. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Until he stood right in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Close enough to smell the familiar blend of whiskey and sandalwood. "Stay," he said. Not a question, not an order, a plea. Mira lifted her face to his, amber eyes meeting gray in the darkness of the grand hall. "Give me a reason," she said, her voice trembling but not weak. "A real reason. Not because Theo needs me. Not because you owe me. A reason for me to stay and destroy myself by watching you marry someone else." Callum studied her, searching her eyes as though hunting for an answer to a question he didn't yet know how to ask. Then he did something she never expected. He raised his hand, his fingers brushing her cheek with a touch as light as a butterfly's wing, as though she were made of glass and he was afraid of breaking her. Then he bent down and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of hunger or possession. It was the kiss of surrender. His mouth met hers, warm and unhurried, like a promise, like a confession, like every word he couldn't say out loud. Mira dropped the suitcase. She didn't remember deciding to kiss him back, only knew her hands were gripping his shirt and pulling him closer as though he were a lifeline and she was drowning. When they parted, they were both breathing hard. Callum rested his forehead against hers, his gray eyes now burning with something Mira didn't dare name. "Is that reason enough?" he murmured hoarsely. Mira didn't answer. She only kissed him again. St. Patrick's Church blazed beneath the glow of thousands of candles. White roses lined every pew. Incense mingled with the expensive perfume worn by 500 of the most powerful people in America. This wasn't merely a wedding. It was a declaration of dominance. Mafia bosses from New York, Los Angeles, Miami, and Las Vegas sat among politicians, judges, and businessmen whose names appeared on Forbes while their money was never audited. Malcolm Ashworth occupied the front row, silver hair slicked back perfectly and satisfaction curling on his lips. Today his daughter would become mistress of the Brennan Empire, and the power of 2 dynasties would fuse into something untouchable. Mira stood in the final row of the church, half hidden behind a granite column, her heart hammering as though it might burst from her ribs. She didn't know why she was there. She should have been home with Theo. She should have stayed far away from this place. She should never have had to watch Callum waiting at the altar for another woman. Yet she couldn't stay away. She needed to see it with her own eyes. She needed to know everything was over before it had truly begun. The night before, after the kiss in the grand hall, Callum hadn't said another word. He'd only looked at her with burning gray eyes before turning and disappearing into the shadows. That morning he'd left the estate to prepare for the wedding without explanation or promise. All that remained was that kiss and the silence afterward. Then the organ thundered, announcing the bride's entrance. Mira watched Victoria glide down the aisle in a pristine Vera Wang gown white as snow, a veil thin as mist, white roses in her hands. She looked beautiful as an angel, and Mira hated herself for thinking it. Victoria stopped at the altar beside Callum in his black three-piece suit. They looked flawless together, like a magazine spread, incarnations of wealth and power. Finn stood behind them as best man, his smile unable to hide the greed in his eyes. The priest began the rite, speaking familiar words about love and fidelity, and death alone parting them. Mira turned to leave. She couldn't stand there listening. Then the priest's voice halted and asked whether anyone objected to the marriage now, or forever hold their peace. Silence smothered the church. 500 people held their breath. Callum spoke. "I object." The two words detonated through the nave. Victoria froze, bouquet trembling in her hands. Malcolm Ashworth leapt to his feet, his face red with fury. Murmurs rippled like a tidal wave. Callum turned toward the crowd, gray eyes sweeping stunned faces, and repeated that he objected because his bride had tried to kill his son and his best man had helped plan it. Victoria stammered and demanded whether it was a joke, her face blanching to match her dress. Callum drew his phone and nodded to Tommy near the sound system. A massive screen descended. The recording played. Victoria's voice was sharp and unmistakable. "What about the boy? He's the only heir. We can't let him stand between us and the Brennan Empire." Finn's voice followed. "Accidents happen every day. An 8-year-old could fall downstairs or drown in a pool." Then footage showed Victoria smiling at her phone as she locked the Bentley with Theo inside. 500 guests stared in horrified silence. Malcolm collapsed into his seat, ash gray. He knew the Ashworth dynasty had just been destroyed before the entire American underworld. His daughter hadn't merely betrayed Callum Brennan, she'd plotted to murder a child. In their world, that was unforgivable. Victoria screamed that it was lies and that Callum had staged everything. He only nodded. 4 men in black suits emerged from either side of the church. 2 advanced on Victoria. 2 moved toward Finn. Finn tried to flee, but Tommy blocked the sole exit and drove him to the floor, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face pressed into the same red carpet Victoria had walked minutes earlier. He shouted that Callum was his brother and they were blood. Callum descended the dais and stood over him. He said coldly that yes, he was his brother, and he'd planned to kill his son, and in this world blood meant nothing when you betrayed family. He turned away. Finn and Victoria were dragged from the church beneath the gaze of 500 witnesses who didn't dare utter a word. They had just seen Callum Brennan incinerate a powerful alliance, expose his own brother's treachery, and disgrace the Ashworth clan before the entire Mafia elite of America. In the final pew, Mira stood frozen, her heart racing, unsure whether to cry or laugh. Callum hadn't married Victoria. He'd planned everything, and now he was walking toward her. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Callum walked through the church. 500 pairs of eyes followed every step, but he didn't look at any of them. His gray eyes were fixed in only one direction, toward the back of the nave where Mira stood frozen like a statue, her back against a granite column, her fingers clenched around the edge of the pew until her knuckles blanched white. She wanted to run. She wanted to vanish beneath the weight of hundreds of heads turning to follow his path, but her legs refused to move. All she could do was stand there and watch him approach, one measured step at a time, slow and deliberate, like a man who'd made a decision and knew nothing on earth could alter it. Callum stopped in front of her, not too close, but close enough for her to see the twitch of muscle along his jaw, the exhaustion shadowing his gray eyes, the faint lines of worry he tried and failed to hide. He didn't kneel. He didn't produce a diamond ring or a rehearsed speech. He simply stood there facing her, 2 people in a church full of strangers, and looked into her eyes as though she were the only person left in the universe. "I'm not good at asking," he said, his voice rough, utterly unlike the cold, commanding tone he'd used moments earlier to destroy Victoria and Finn. I don't know how to speak sweetly. I don't know how to promise things I'm not sure I can keep. I only know that I don't want you to leave." He paused and swallowed as though the next words were harder than any execution order he'd ever given. "I'm asking. Not commanding. Asking. Will you stay?" Mira stared at him, at the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago standing before her with eyes full of things he didn't know how to name. Fear, hope, and something deeper and fiercer. Something they were both afraid to call love because it was too fragile, too new, too terrifying. She thought of all the reasons she should say no. He was Mafia. He killed people. He lived in a world of blood and shadow she'd never imagined belonging to. If she stayed, she'd become part of that world. She wouldn't be able to pretend she was only an innocent nanny anymore. Then she thought of Theo, of the boy's solemn gray eyes, of the half-protein bar he'd shared with her in the dark garden, of the way he'd rested his head in her palm for the first time after 3 months of silence. She thought of the two in the morning conversation in the kitchen, of words that hadn't been tender yet had felt truer than any confession. She thought of last night's kiss, of the way Callum had looked at her as though she were the only light in the darkness he'd lived inside for 37 years. And she thought of herself, of the orphan girl who'd survived 12 foster homes, of the woman who'd endured 4 years with Derek, of Mira Collins who'd run to Chicago with $300 and a shattered heart and had somehow found a family in the place she'd least expected. "Yes," she said, one word, but it carried everything. Callum didn't smile. He didn't pull her into an embrace or kiss her in front of 500 staring witnesses. He only extended his hand, palm up, waiting. And Mira placed her hand in his. Her hand with the scars from shattered Bentley glass fit into his. The same hand that had killed and tortured enemies yet now held her with a gentleness reserved for something priceless. "Dad, Callum." "Miss Mira." The familiar voices rang out from the church doors. Mira turned and saw Theo racing toward them, with Mrs. Chen following behind, anxious and smiling at once. The boy hurled himself between them, his small arms wrapping around both of them together, dragging them closer. "Miss Mira isn't leaving, is she?" Theo asked, gray eyes lifted toward her with hope and fear tangled inside. "You promise you're not going to go?" Mira knelt, one hand still in Callum's, the other smoothing Theo's hair. "I promise, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." And there in the middle of street, Patrick's church before 500 guests, who hadn't yet recovered from shock, 3 people found one another without kisses, without tears, without any dramatic display at all. They simply stood there holding hands. A family forged from darkness and pain that had finally found the light. 1 year later, the house in Lake Forest had no black granite walls or stained glass windows like the Brennan estate. It was a colonial revival home with red brick, white-framed windows, and a backyard garden where Theo could play without dodging secret meetings or dangerous guests. The house sat at the end of a quiet road, 45 minutes by car from Chicago, far enough to separate them from the old world, and close enough for Callum to still manage his business. Mira Brennan, still not quite used to her new last name, stood in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, pouring pancake batter into a pan while listening to Theo thunder down the stairs. Bruno, the golden retriever that Callum had bought for Theo on his 9th birthday, barking excitedly behind him. "Careful on the stairs, sweetheart," Mira called without turning around, because she already knew every sound this house made. The rhythm of Theo's footsteps, the tap of Bruno's claws on the wooden floor, the coffee machine switching on automatically at 6:45 every morning, the quiet click of Callum's office door when he rose early to handle work. Their wedding had taken place 6 months earlier in the rose garden of the new house, with only 20 guests in attendance. "Mrs. Chen cried through the entire ceremony. Tommy stood as witness with his usual stone face, though his eyes were rimmed red. Theo carried the rings, wearing a gray suit like his father, with his hair neatly combed for the first time in his life without anyone forcing him. Mira wore a simple white dress, not Vera Wang or Valentino, just something she'd found at a local boutique for $300, because she didn't need an expensive gown. She only needed the man waiting for her before the small altar set among roses, with gray eyes looking at her like she was a miracle he didn't deserve. Callum's vows weren't flowery. "You taught me that real strength isn't in controlling others," he said, his voice rough from emotions he wasn't used to revealing. "Real strength is allowing someone into your heart even when you know they could shatter it. You walked into my heart, Mira, and I'll spend the rest of my life being worthy of that." The year hadn't been easy. Callum had lost much after the scandal at Street. Patrick's church. The Ashworth Alliance collapsed completely. Malcolm Ashworth was shunned by other families because his daughter had violated the one rule no one forgave: never harm children. Victoria was sent to a convent in Europe, a punishment gentler than death but still a permanent exile. Finn sat in a federal prison, sharing a cell block with Derek Cole, a coincidence Mira doubted was accidental. Some long-standing Brennan allies had turned away, not because they disagreed with what Callum did to Victoria and Finn, but because they feared a man willing to burn a powerful alliance for love. A man like that couldn't be predicted or controlled, and in their world, that was dangerous. Callum lost about half his empire. Contracts vanished. Partners withdrew. Illegal revenue streams were cut off. But he still had enough. Enough to live. Enough to protect his family. Enough to rebuild in a different way. He shifted toward legitimate ventures. Real estate. Construction. Investments. It wasn't easy or fast, but he was doing it for Theo. For Mira. For the future he wanted to give them. Mira had changed too. She finished the nursing certificate she'd abandoned in Boston, studying nights after Theo went to bed and passing her exam last month. Now she worked part-time at a pediatric clinic in Lake Forest 3 days a week, while Theo was in school. She didn't need the money, and Callum had made that clear, but she needed the work. She needed to know she was still Mira Collins, the woman who'd survived 12 foster homes and 4 years of hell with Derek, the woman who could stand on her own even if the world collapsed around her. She didn't want to be only Callum Brennan's wife. She wanted to be herself. And Callum understood that. He never stopped her, or asked her to quit, or stay home. He only asked if she was happy. And when she said yes, he nodded and never questioned her further. That was how Callum loved. Not with sweet words or grand gestures, but with respect, with space for her to be herself, with sitting beside her every night holding her hand until she fell asleep. "Mom, Mira, I want bear-shaped pancakes." Theo ran into the kitchen with Bruno wagging wildly behind him, and Mira turned with a smile. The boy had started calling her mom 3 months earlier, the first time by accident when he'd blurted it out and flushed with embarrassment. She'd hugged him and said she was happy and he could call her whatever he liked. From then on, Mom Mira stuck. "Bear pancakes are almost ready, sweetheart," she said. "Go wash your hands." Heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Callum appeared in the doorway with damp hair from the shower and sleeves rolled to his elbows. He paused, watching Mira flip pancakes and Theo washing his hands, and a small smile touched his mouth, the kind no one would have believed Callum Brennan capable of a year ago. "Can I help with anything?" he asked, the former Mafia boss now asking his wife how he could assist with breakfast. Mira looked at him, then at Theo, then at Bruno, lying under the table waiting for scraps. "Pour the orange juice," she said, "and stop sneaking Bruno bacon." "I don't know what you're talking about," Callum replied innocently, though his gray eyes sparkled. Mira shook her head, hiding a smile. 1 year ago, she'd come to Chicago with $300 and a shattered heart. Now she had a home, a family, and a future she'd never dared to dream of. Life wasn't perfect. She still woke from nightmares about Derek. Callum still took secret calls behind closed doors. Shadows from the past still followed them both. But they were trying together, and sometimes that was all anyone needed. That afternoon, they visited Sarah Brennan's grave at Rose Hill Cemetery on Chicago's north side, the headstone resting beneath an old oak tree with white marble engraved. Sarah Elizabeth Brennan, beloved wife and wonderful mother, 1985 to 2020. Theo placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums at the base, the flowers he said his mother loved most, standing there for a long time with his lips moving as if speaking to someone only he could hear, before turning to Mira with shining gray eyes and asking, "Mom Mira, can I introduce you to Mom Sarah?" Mira knelt beside him with one hand on his shoulder and the other brushing the cold stone as she looked at the name of the woman she'd never met, yet who had somehow tied her life to Callum and Theo, and said softly, "Hello, Sarah. My name is Mira. I'm taking care of Theo and Callum, and I know I can never replace you, and I don't want to replace you. I only want to promise that I'll love your son as my own. I'll be beside him at every step, every fall, every moment he needs a hand to hold." She paused, swallowing the emotion rising in her throat before adding, "And I'll take care of Callum too. I know he suffered terribly after losing you. I see it in his eyes every day, even when he tries to hide it. But he's trying to become a better man, a better father, a better human being. And I'll stay with him on that journey. Thank you for giving birth to Theo. Thank you for loving Callum. And thank you for letting me become part of this family." Callum stood behind her, listening in silence. And when she rose and turned back, She saw his gray eyes glistening, though he'd never admit it, and he only squeezed her hand gently, a thank you without words. That evening, the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset stain the lake forest sky red while Bruno slept at Theo's feet, his tail twitching, as cool autumn air carried the scent of dry leaves and pine from the nearby woods. They didn't talk much. Callum drank coffee. Mira sipped tea. Theo scrolled through old photos on his phone, until suddenly he looked up, bright-eyed, and said, "Let's take a family picture. We haven't had one since we moved here." Callum raised a brow and muttered that he didn't take photos and hated them, but Theo stretched out the word Dad, using the secret weapon he knew always worked, and pleaded, "Please." Callum glanced at Mira for help, but she only shrugged and smiled and said, "You lost, Mr. Brennan." So the former Mafia boss, the man who once made all of Chicago tremble, squeezed onto the porch swing with his wife and son, wearing a slight grimace as Theo lifted the phone for a selfie, counting 1, 2, 3, smile. And they didn't smile, not the polished, radiant kind from advertisements, because Callum looked like he was enduring a sentence. Mira was trying not to laugh at her husband's face, and Theo was beaming with pure happiness. The picture wasn't perfect, the light too dim, the angle crooked. Bruno jumping just as Theo tapped the screen, leaving only a blur of golden fur in the corner. But it was their first photo as a family, and it was real. More real than any flawless image. Their life wasn't a fairy tale. Callum still faced ghosts from his Mafia past. Mira still woke from Derek nightmares sometimes. Theo still had days when he missed his birth mother so badly he couldn't speak to anyone. They didn't live happily ever after the way fairy tales ended. They lived honestly, with good days and bad days, smiles and tears, small arguments and reconciliations, with love imperfect yet strong enough to weather every storm, and sometimes that was the truest version of happiness life could offer. The story of Callum, Mira, and Theo taught that family isn't always formed by blood. Sometimes it's strangers finding one another in darkness, taking hands and walking toward the light. Sometimes love arrives from the place we least expect, with people we never thought could belong in our world. And sometimes real strength isn't power or money, but the courage to change, to love, and to let someone into your heart. If this story touched you, please like and share it with those you love. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the emotional stories we bring every day. How did this story make you feel? Was there a moment that brought tears to your eyes? Did any character remind you of someone in your own life? We'd truly love to hear what's in your heart, so please share in the comments below. Every story, every experience matters to us. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and we wish you and your loved ones good health, joyful days, and peace in every moment. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.